All right, so now we have 2.5, multiplication of rational numbers. And we're going to talk about kind of the rules that go along with multiplication. So if we're looking at a positive times a positive, the answer is going to be a positive. Or a negative times a negative, the answer is going to be a positive. If they have the same signs, your answer will be positive. If they're different, it's going to be negative. A negative times a positive is a positive times a negative is a negative. So if the two signs are different or opposites kind of hard when you're looking at it's not a number, but it's one positive, one negative, then you're going to get negative as your answer, negative number. So let's do some of these problems together. So a positive times a negative would be a negative, and I hope that you know 8 times 5 would be 40. Okay. Positive times a negative is a negative. Okay, again, if you're not real comfortable with the decimal points, then go ahead and do the long multiplication. 5 times 2 is 10. 5 times 7 would be 35, plus 1 would be 36. There's one number behind the decimal, so I need one number behind the decimal. So I get negative 36. Okay. All right. So now start with the easy part. A negative times a negative becomes a positive. When you're multiplying fractions, you multiply straight across. So 5 times 1 is 5. 3 times 7 is 21. So that's my answer. Okay. All right. Again, a negative times a positive is a negative. If we again are having problems with that decimal point, 4.5 times 20. Oops, I should be 20. So 0. And then 2 times 5 is 10. 2 times 4 is 8, plus 1 is 9. There's one number behind the decimal, so we get negative 90. All right, so now a couple of other things to think about. We've only done so far 2 numbers. When you have more than 2 numbers, you're multiplying together. So like this problem or this problem. If there's an even number of negatives, then your answer will be positive. If there's an odd number of negatives, then your answer will be negative. So if we look here, we're looking at 2 negatives, which is an even number of negatives. The answer is positive. 1 negative, the answer is negative. So even though it goes for everything, I think I use it more when I'm looking at longer problems. So in the case of this problem, I have 1, 2, 3 negatives. That's an odd number, so my answer will be negative. The other thing you can do is group them in twos. You know a negative times a negative is a positive. A positive times a negative would be negative. Times a positive would be negative. So just remembering those things, you don't have to worry. Depending on how good you are with fractions, you might realize that there's a 7 on top and a 7 on the bottom. There's a 1. Remember, if we can find the number on top and on the bottom, they make 1. If you don't see that, then you're going to multiply straight across and simplify after the fact. So a 7 divided by a 7 gives me a 1. I'm going to go ahead and multiply even though I know I can still simplify. So I have 1. I've already know my answer is negative, so I'm just looking basic numbers, the absolute values of those numbers. 1 times 2 is 2, times 1 is 2, times 9 is 18. Across the bottom here, 1 times 3 times 1 times 1 gives me 3. And now I go, okay, I see it. I could have simplified that even more. Still negative. 18 divided by 3 is 6. So coming down here, I have 2 negatives. That's an even number of negatives, so my answer will be positive. I can now just ignore the symbols and just work with the numbers. 5 times 4 is 20, times 3, 60, times 2, 120. So a negative times a negative is a positive, and then you add all those positives.